if I recall. There we go. On the Wakefield Beach oyster burger. The inn's gone now, sadly, I gather. But anyhow, I got further subsequent to that invited to house sit for Janice in the summer, and I got to go painting and driving around, and the only thing was I was to look after the two cats who were allowed to go out. And we knew, and I was warned that there was bears around. And in fact, I later heard bears around, and the garbage had to be secured, etc. And the first night when they were gone and the cats were out and it's getting dusk, and I'm calling the cats, and they look at me like, yeah, what are you going to do? And so they finally sauntered in, and I thought, I didn't want Janice to come back and know how the cats are. And I say, you see that pile of bear poop and that pile of bear poop? Well, those are the cats. So the cats were grounded for the length of my stay. They weren't very happy, but they were grounded and they were safely returned to the owner. But it was a wonderful experience. And subsequent, I was invited by Janice up to meet to the Longhouse and see the Paul family and carving. And I'll speak about that towards the end. So many wonderful contacts and Janice and what Janice has been doing. So I had a visit over a year ago now in Vancouver where I heard Janice's story, and I thought more people need to hear this. I think it's quite fascinating. So can we go into the slides? We'll get started. And I'll begin, and then I'll hand it over to Janice. So first off, I'll say bienvenue, Janice. Je suis heureux de vous être ici ce soir. We're glad to have you here. And in Mohawk, I'll say skonagoaga, which is how are things going? Comment ça va? I invite you who are in other places to reflect on the First Nations territory upon which you find yourself. But McGill University is on land which has long served as a meeting site and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe and the Kanien'kehá:ka nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Can we have the next slide, please? I had to go to Scotland to find this, but that's the lengths I will go to for a good talk. This is a painting by the controversial painter David Hockney, painted in 1965. It's in the National Gallery, the Modern Gallery in Edinburgh. And this painting is called Rocky Mountains and Tired Indians. I just roared when I saw it. He was in Boulder, Colorado. He'd been in California and painted some of his most famous pieces in California. But this was up in Boulder in a room that had no windows. And he painted this sort of a critique of the American idea of the Wild West. And the mountains are sort of like abstract expressionists the Americans were boasting about. And you notice the clouds, where there could almost be smoke signals. And we've got the mixture of the Navajo, I suspect, by the hat and almost a mummified figure of the female. If you look at her, it's sort of she's encased, and they're standing there in front of the cacti for the tourist photographs. And they're Indians. It doesn't matter where they're from; they're just Indians. And so you've got this West Coast totem pole with Navajo, but whatever. It's just what happened here? Disconnected. So I thought the theme, the Indians are past being tired. They are tired. They are tired of waiting for justice, and they're somewhat angry. And so I think we'll need more than a chair, but this is on a process of readjusting how we live together on this land. And so I'm going to pass it over to Janice.
Thank you, Doug. I'd forgotten that you'd come and house sat at our place and really got a good chance to get to experience the Sunshine Coast a bit. I want to acknowledge that I'm here in South Surrey, British Columbia, on the unceded traditional ancestral lands of the Semiahmoo and other Coast Salish peoples. And it is a privilege to live here and a journey of getting to know our neighbors who have cared for this land for thousands and thousands of years. So thank you, Doug, for inviting me and for the rest of you who've shown up tonight. It's such an honor and a delight to be able to tell this story. It's really become my retirement project, and it's a story of my family. And we've got a number of slides to go through to try and keep me on track so I don't go all over the place. But let's start with the next photo, which is actually a painting by someone you know. In the bottom right-hand corner, you might see the name Troop. This is a painting that Doug did, and when I saw it, I had to buy it and hang it in my house. It it was a carving that he found in Stanley Park. Somebody was starting to make something that looked like a totem pole, and it kind of got abandoned, I believe, and half covered by greenery. Uh, but when I saw it, it became for me what I call a haunting, a persistent haunting. It was or is this face looking at me, and I thought of it as John the Baptist, perhaps, saying, "What are you going to do? How are you going to live into right relations in Canada with our First Nations brothers and sisters?" And wherever I went in the house, it would always look at me and say, "What are you going to do? What are you going to do?" So that was back in 2005 or 2006, I think, when I got this painting. And I became very involved in our church's work for Truth and Reconciliation and helping prepare the churches in BC for the Vancouver TRC in 2013. Lots of wonderful opportunities to start building relations with Indigenous people here in British Columbia. And yeah, it was a very, very good time. Good work and important work that we were doing. But at the same time, I was aware that I had a need to do some work with my family story. So if we can go to the next slide. On the left-hand side is my great-grandfather, Philip Jacobson. He came as a young man in his 20s from Tromsø, Norway, way up above the Arctic Circle, at the call of his older brother, Adrian. Adrian had been commissioned by the Ethnological Museum of Berlin to come to British Columbia to collect cultural objects from Indigenous communities on the Central Coast. And Adrian wrote to Philip and said, "There's lots of work here. I need you to come and help me." And so this young man came. And together, the two of them spent a number of years traveling up and down the coast, collecting artifacts to send to the museum in Berlin. They also collected other things that went to various museums around the world. The initial display of artifacts in the Royal BC Museum in Victoria were things that were donated by Philip. So with Philip in this picture are my great grandmother on the right-hand side, another Norwegian. The two of them, their families came to, Helga's family came to Bella Coola, and she met Philip and they married. And my grandmother is the young woman holding the baby, and the baby is my mom. So this picture was taken about 1933, and it's the only picture I have of these three generations, and it just brings me great joy to see them. So when I was a youngster growing up, I heard the story of how Philip and Adrian Jacobson came to British Columbia and did this work, and what courageous, adventurous, entrepreneurial men they were. And the story was told with great pride, and that was a story I knew and believed, and that's true. And then as I got older, I began to realize how my family had benefited from the work that they did, collecting, taking cultural objects, cultural treasures from these indigenous communities to be put in glass boxes halfway around the world in museums. And I started to feel, um, I guess it was shame, and wondered how uh, just wondered about this story and didn't know what to do with that story. It just sat there and I couldn't really talk about it because I didn't know how to talk about it. And then in 2017, I had moved from the Sunshine Coast and was at Peninsula United Church here in South Surrey. And I was talking to a friend of mine who happened to be the minister in Bella Coola. That's where Philip ended up living the rest of his life. It reminded him of Norway, and so that's where my mom was born and where she lived until she married my dad. If you don't know BC very well, Bella Coola is about 300 miles north of Vancouver on the coast, so it's very remote. You can fly there, you can drive for 2 days to get there, but it's a beautiful spot, but it is really remote. And so I'd only been there a few times as a youngster, um, but the place keeps calling to me, and that vision of the haunting, persistent haunting face on my in my dining room was calling to me as well. What are you going to do about this? So my friend Donna was the minister in Bella Coola, and I talked to her one day and told her this story and said, I need to do something, but I don't know what to do. I feel the need for some family reconciliation around the fact that they took so many things from from the Nuhawk people in Bella Coola, but other indigenous communities as well. So with Donna's help, we decided to have a small group of folks from my congregation in Surrey go up to Bella Coola and talk about reconciliation. And we had 5 fabulous days there, and I was able to tell the story of my great grandfather and his work and uh, and we heard many stories from the indigenous people and from the two congregations. Bella Coola has an indigenous congregation on the reserve right down in the town site of Bella Coola, and they have a predominantly settler congregation up the valley in a place called Hegensberg, which was initially a Lutheran congregation from the Norwegian immigrants. It is now United Church congregation. So it's a 2-point charge in Bella Coola. So at the end of that time, we had Sunday services in the morning at the Hegensberg Church, and then in the evening at Emmanuel United Church on the reserve. And we had brought some gifts for the congregations. People in my congregation, beautiful fabric artists, had made um, a communion tablecloth, and we offered that to the congregation, and that was received very graciously. And then a woman from the congregation came up, and I had spoken with her a few days earlier in a circle with elders. And if we could have the next picture, please. Um, this is Eleanor Schooner, and if you can see behind Eleanor is the tablecloth that our women from Peninsula made for Emmanuel United Church. It's 6 salmon swimming towards the chalice with the little wafer of bread in the middle, the gold wafer of bread in the middle. So Eleanor came and she held my hands and she said that it had never occurred to her until she heard my story a couple days previously. It had never occurred to her that a white person might be feeling some pain about things that had happened in the past uh, with Indigenous people. And of course, she was referring to the work that my great grandfather did, collecting all of these things and taking them away from Indigenous communities to the museum. So she'd been thinking about that for a couple of days and realized that I was feeling some pain about that. And she looked at me and she said, "I don't want you to feel that pain anymore." So that was a real lovely healing moment for me, and uh, and just the beginning of what has become an amazing journey. Not long after that, uh, I met a cousin from Norway. If we can have the next slide. I'm glad that we're seeing the slides change because I'm only seeing myself. I'm not seeing anybody else. So I hope you're still all there. Um, so this is Sigbjorn Ronbeck, and he is a retired physician from Tromsø, Norway. Uh, he did ancestry.com. He wanted to see where his relatives were that he didn't know about, and he discovered he had relatives in Bella Coola. So he and his wife got on a plane and came to Bella Coola, and they were looking for their relatives. It just so happened my mom was in Bella Coola at the time. They met my mom, and uh, the rest is history. And so Sigbjorn and I have, um, excuse me, have come up with a dream project. So he's very passionate about telling the story of Adrian and Philip Jacobson, and he's gone to numerous museums in North America and in Europe that have some of the cultural objects that they collected. And so he's been the main liaison with museums, and particularly the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, where there are at least 100 cultural objects from the Nuhak Nation, and I don't know from other nations, but they have a totem pole from Haida Gwaii and many other masks, um, many things. And I haven't been to the Humboldt Forum yet, so I can't say what there is, but Sigbjörn knows all of these things. Sigbjørn is also connected with a virtual museum studio in Oslo, Norway, that makes incredible, um, uses 3D scan technology to create virtual museums. So you wear those virtual goggles, and you could be sitting at home, but you're connected through a computer where you can see this amazing museum in front of you. So one of the ones that they've made is the house of Roald Amundsen, who was an explorer of the Arctic and Antarctic. And wearing these goggles, you go into his house and you can see all of his objects, everything that was the way he left his house. His actual house it is a museum in Norway, but it's taking all the visits to the museum is taking its toll on the building itself. So they've decided to make this virtual museum. And so what we're dreaming of is trying to get 3D scans made of the cultural objects that are in the Humboldt Forum to give to the communities here in British Columbia. And we're starting with the Nuhak Nation because of our close family connection that with Bella Coola. So Sigbjorn has the connections in Europe with the museums and with the virtual museum in Oslo. Uh, and my job was to connect with the indigenous communities that we knew the Philip and Adrian Jacobson had collected from. So that was on my agenda for the summer of 2022. And I was going to be on sabbatical, but unfortunately, my mom got sick that spring and she died in May. And so I had to put all those plans on hold. I was the executor and had many things to do. So that was my job that summer. But one of the things I talked with my mom about was whether she wanted her remains to be buried in Bella Coola. She kept talking about going home, and so I said, "Mom, would you like me to take your remains to Bella Coola?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, we'll do that." So that July, my husband and I flew to Bella Coola, and we buried my mom's remains. So you can see us gathered in the next picture. In the little cemetery in Bella Coola, we're standing around my grandmother's grave, and my grandfather is there, and the whole family and many of my mom's friends are all buried in that area. And because of the trip we'd made to Bella Coola in 2017, I knew some of the folks in the church, and I asked if any of them would like to come and join us for the graveside service, because otherwise it would have just been my husband and I, and all of my close relatives have died, and I don't know many people, but the church there feels like family. So these are folks, actually a couple of distant relatives and folks from the church that came to be with us when we buried my mom's ashes. So that was really a real gift to me. Then, while we were up there, we wanted to go and explore this kind of derelict old cannery that my great grandfather had built in 1917. So, if we can see the next picture, that's what's left of the cannery. The fellow that owns this, what's left of the cannery now, and there's other buildings as well, has turned it into a guest house. So we wanted to. You have to take a boat across the channel to get to it. So we went down to the harbor and talked to the harbor master to say, well, where do we park when we and where do we catch the boat and all those questions. And I mentioned to her that my great grandfather had built it, and she immediately, now this is no lie, immediately put her hand out and she said, "Hi, I'm Cindy Nygaard. I'm your second cousin twice removed." And then began this really interesting conversation. So she's into ancestry.com as well. She knows the family story. She as soon as she knew that I was connected to Philip Jacobson and that cannery, she knew who I was and how we were connected. And then she asked about Sigbjorn because she had met Sigbjorn when he had been in Bella Coola a few years earlier when he met my mom. So I told her about Sigbjorn and said, uh, uh, told her about the project that we're working on to make these 3D scans of masks and other cultural objects to give back to the First Nations. And she said, "Oh, well, would you like to meet one of the hereditary chiefs? He's sitting out on the dock right now, and he was maybe 50 meters from us." And I said, "Oh, yes, please. That's what I'd wanted to do all along, but I just put it aside." And so we went out and we met Derek, if we can see the next slide. So there's my second cousin, Cindy, on the left, and me, and Chief Derek Snow under the no parking sign. We had a good laugh about that. I had about 5 minutes to talk to Derek, and then he said to me, "Well, would you like to come and talk to the other hereditary chiefs about this project?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please. That would be wonderful. That's, again, just exactly what I wanted." So a couple of days later, we met with 8 hereditary chiefs. We talked for 3 hours. We had this amazing conversation. If we could see the next slide, please. So here are my husband with the Johnny Cash black t-shirt is next to me. That's Henry. On the other side of me is Chief Derek Snow, and beside him is his daughter Judy. And then the other three, the three at the back and the two on the left are hereditary chiefs as well. So at the end of our conversation, Jeffrey Snow, who's the man in the black t-shirt standing behind me, thanked me for coming and appreciated hearing the apology I had made about all of the things that had been taken away from them, and really hope that we would be able to get these 3D scans made and given to the community. But he said it might not happen in our lifetime. And that has stuck with me because I so want it to happen in our lifetime. And that's what I've been working on ever since meeting them in the summer of 2022. Not long after we went home, I had a phone call from Derek, and he was asking me about a particular totem pole that was in the Royal BC Museum. It was his great grandfather's totem pole, and he wondered if Philip Jacobson had collected it. And I said I wasn't sure, but what he asked next was, would I come with him and his family to be a witness at talks at the Royal BC Museum. Um, this is kind of a long story. I'll try and make it short, but Derek had asked for this totem pole to come back to his family, and this is his family standing in front of that beautiful totem pole. Thanks for changing the slide. You're right on top of things. So that's the museum, the Royal BC Museum, agreed that they should have the pole back, but it got delayed because of COVID and other things, and he was getting impatient and had actually launched a lawsuit against the Royal BC Museum and the provincial government. So these talks were going to be happening to settle out of court, and Derek asked if I would come and be part of that. To witness those talks. And it was my honor to be there. And it was obvious right away that the museum realized they had dropped the ball and they were doing everything they could to get these to get this totem pole back to Derek. So that was in September, and the following February, the totem pole was returned to Bella Coola. If we can see the next slide. This is at the Royal BC Museum on February 13th, 2023. A crane is lifting the totem pole that's all carefully wrapped on that pallet from the third floor and bringing it down. And we're all just holding our breath. And the Nuhawk singers were drumming and singing as well as it was coming out into the fresh air for the first time in 100 years. Next slide, please. There's Derek looking very, very happy in all of his regalia as we were awaiting the totem pole. On the left is the CBC reporter who did an amazing job covering this story. I put a link in the chat if you are interested in reading more about it and seeing the videos that were on the news that night. They, as I say, they did a really good job. Next slide. So there was probably 100, maybe 150 Nuhawk people that had come from Bella Coola and from other places where they're living now for this celebration. So there we are on the steps of the museum. Next slide. And then the celebrations carried on for 2 days in the Mungo Martin Longhouse at the Royal BC Museum, beginning with government officials and representatives from the museum, and lots of speeches and lots of singing and dancing, and just a wonderful, wonderful time. And again, I was so happy that I was able to be there. Next photo. So then we're jumping ahead a bit. To the summer of 2023, I went back up to Bella Coola. Henry and I went back up to Bella Coola, and I realized that if this project was going to happen, I needed to be connected to as many people as possible that were involved in the cultural aspects of the band. So that's, and I don't have a picture of him, but Clyde Talio is the band cultural director, and he happens to be half Nuhawk and half Norwegian. I don't think we're related, but and a very talented young man who is working anything to do with museums, and the Nuhawk that's his authority, that's his work. So we met with Clyde to talk about this project, and I started to realize that it's very complicated, and that not everybody within the Nuhawk Nation has the same ideas, and no surprise there, like any family or any community, people have different ideas, and they're not all in agreement of how things should happen. So I've spent the last year getting to know Clyde and discovered that the best way to communicate with him is through texting. He's younger than me, and that's how they do it. So we've had wonderful conversations over the past year with texting. I did get to see him last January and some of the hereditary chiefs again when I was invited by our region to represent the region at the covenanting service for the Bella Coola Pastoral Charge and their new ministers. So here are folks from the two congregations after the covenanting service, and it was just a really, really good time to be up there. It happened to be minus 27 degrees in Bella Coola when we were up there. It was like the coldest time ever, but it's okay. We were having a good time. Next slide. And I've carried on traveling up to Bella Coola to continue meeting with folks as much as I can. This past September, we were in Bella Coola for a memorial potlatch for Chief Derek Snow's wife, who died 2 years ago. And we weren't allowed to take many pictures of the singing and dancing, but this was one we were allowed to take pictures of the women doing their paddle dance. That was a wonderful occasion to be there. And the last photo, I think it's the last photo. Here's the picture of the Reverend Nancy Walker on the left-hand side, and Chief Derek Snow and myself at the potlatch. So one of the things that I'm working on now with the Bella Coola Pastoral Charge is to organize a day-long consultation next May in Bella Coola at the Emmanuel United Church so we want to gather the hereditary chiefs, the band cultural director, the chief and council, the elected chief and council of the band, and anybody else that we think is important, some of the elders who are part of the church, to talk about this 3D scanning project, to discuss the benefits of it, the concerns that they might have, the challenges that we face. And so the United Church has agreed to partner with me and in making that day-long consultation happen. We actually put in a application for a grant from the Seeds of Hope, the United Church Foundation, and I'm still waiting with bated breath to find out if we will receive anything from the Seeds of Hope. But I'm really that's the next piece. And if we can have that consultation and come to agreement of how we move forward on this project, then Sigbjørn and I can start looking for funding from governments and museums in Canada and in Europe. So to make this happen and get these scans to them so that they can create their own virtual museum in Bella Coola. And hopefully we can pass it on, get this similar kind of project working with other communities as well in British Columbia. So that's what I'm up to with the help of my friends in the Bella Coola Pastoral Charge, and really happy to be able to tell you about it. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Before I address this, Janice, could you speak a little bit about what is a hereditary chief, or you're using that term?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So the hereditary chiefs, that this would be a system of governance and authority prior to colonization. So the hereditary chiefs, each family or each tribe would have a chief, and together they would make decisions for the welfare of the people. I'm not sure how many hereditary chiefs there are altogether in Bella Coola. I'm at 8, but I think there's a few more. At one time, there was as many as 30 different village sites that was the Nuhawk Nation. And with the smallpox epidemic and other diseases, 90% of the population of the Nuhawk people died. And so I can't even imagine what that would do to a community to lose 90% of your people, all ages and all the different skills, and how did they manage? So the one way they managed to survive was everybody came together into one village in Bella Coola, the little town of Bella Coola. But all of those hereditary chiefs know that they come from one of these other village sites, and they bring the history and the traditions of those sites with them in that oral history. The elected chief and council is a system of governance that has been imposed upon Indigenous communities in Canada by the federal government, by the Indian Act. So they are the ones that govern, and they're elected by the people, but they're not they in many communities, the elected chief and council and the hereditary chiefs are not always in sync. And we've seen that a lot in British Columbia in the last few years, particularly around the natural gas pipelines. There's been dissension, and hereditary chiefs have not been in agreement with decisions made by chief and council in some of the nations that have allowed the pipelines to come through their lands. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I just think it's, we have similar things here, but the language different, and so it's good to be aware of just the struggles of regaining your own self as a
Mhm.
First Nation and that whole journey. I mean, always there, but after coming out of oppression,
Yeah,
and in still ways many still in, but that emergence and then the struggle of emergence and of a renaissance, really a rebirthing of peoples,
yeah,
uh, is like, for instance, uh, when I was visiting with Janice, and as I said, I mentioned we went up to the Longhouse and the Paul family, and I got some sketches I did of, and maybe at some point still a painting of them carving a totem pole. I mean, it was just the scent, the smell of the cedar, I mean, it just was so amazing to be there. But then to go into the Longhouse, because I was there having come from being in next door in Ganawage, along with four other churches. We were linked together. And the longhouse here is off limits to non-native people because of the length of exposure to Europeans here, as opposed to the West Coast. And so to be in a longhouse and to experience the stories, and uh, Janice had arranged when my parents came out. We went up to the Sunshine Coast and went to Gibson's Landing, and I mean, stories of my growing up, and then went up to Sechelt, and then went to meet the Paul family at the Longhouse. And because my parents' elders and the respect for elders, they were taken through the Longhouse. It was and explained, and it was an amazing event for me, very, very deeply. One of the great times we had together as a family, quite wonderful. So when I was at Ellesmere and they decided to sell their church and got permission to go to Simon Fraser University, they wanted that ministry and redesigned a church. We redesigned a space within the town hall of the emerging university that's next door to on the top of the mountain next to Simon Fraser University, the Burnaby campus. And we were redesigning, and so there was a whole theological process of going through what we wanted. The floor was the Chartres labyrinth. It was etched concrete, and they didn't want stained glass. They wanted to be connected to nature, to see nature. You're on a sacred site on the top of a mountain, and to be able to see out the windows. And the church so often set itself away from the world and away from the environment, and so needed to be in the environment. And we even had a beach garden in the room, again, making that connection indoor-outdoor. But the other aspect was we found a piece of driftwood from the Sunshine Coast that we turned upside down and made a glass bowl that became the baptismal font. And we then started talking about a communion table and what do we want? And fortunately, one of the members of the congregation was an architect. So we were working together and designed a table that would be very easily moved. It could just a light touch could move it. But we wanted to see if we could get something carved for it. And so to Janice, to the Pauls, who said, well, who you need to talk to is the leading Musqueam artist, Susan Point, who you're seeing here. So we made an appointment, and I called thinking, oh, geez, well, it's going to be hard because she's now an incredibly famous West Coast artist, North American artist, and delighted to have us. And went to her workshop just near Richmond, near YVR. If you've been there, in fact, if you've been into the airport in Vancouver, YVR, you've seen Susan's work. It's there. I think one of the most beautiful airports. And the same if you've been down to Stanley Park and seen totem poles, Susan's work. And if you notice the territorial acknowledgement that we started this with, Susan's work. So she said, sure. And what we wanted was, where do our traditions, where can they make bridges? Where can they come together again? Where can we join and heal and move in a better direction, swim in a better direction? And so she decided, she says, well, I'll carve two fronts, two pieces, one for the celebrant to see and one for the people to see. And the finance person of our group said, and she gave a price, and it was not insignificant. It would be worth a heck of a lot more now. But the comment was, well, how much for one panel? She said, same price. So you want two? You want one? Same price. I thought, good for you, Susan. How to challenge a settler mindset. Anyhow, she did, and we had a celebration when they were installed. And then later, subsequent, I left, and the church was dissolving, and they had money in some churches. Politics, we love one another unconditionally, but we love them better if one church has a lot of money. Funny that. Anyhow, I heard, oh, we want the table. Oh, well, who's getting the table? Who's getting? And so I talked among the people, and we said, nah, we're giving it to National. And so we talked to National. And so the table that came from that was carved by Susan, that comes from this story, that is on the theme of truth and reconciliation, is in the National office in Toronto. And I still would love to have a picture of Carmen, who I knew quite early on as a young girl, behind the table. But there's of what's in Toronto, who carved it, and the story of this, of truth and reconciliation, and finding a better path forward. So I'm going to conclude there, open it up for questions. And again, to thank you, Janice, for sharing your personal story. The desire was for us to start to examine our own stories of interactions with First Nations community in our family history. I talked with my cousin who's now living in Australia, and she has an arrowhead that came from the Ottawa Valley that my grandma Troop gave to her. But that's all we know. And, we were a loyalist family and settled. So obviously we had interaction with First Nations, but that has been forgotten. It was never seen as much of something to talk about. So to start to talk about, to start to explore is important. And can we go to screen view? And I hope, Janice, you can stay for a bit and we can have some questions, if there are any. Side by side. So
I'm just busy typing in something for the chat. It's a book study that the National Church offered last year called Healing Haunted Histories, A Settler Discipleship of Decolonization. And it was an excellent book study and one that anybody could do. You don't need the national staff to lead you through it. But it follows the story of a Canadian woman, Elaine Enns, a Mennonite background, who realized that her family had profited from land given to her family that had been indigenous land, but it was given by the government to these immigrants so that they could farm it. And so she began to explore her family history. And the book Healing Haunted Histories, you'll see that in the chat, is the story and theological reflection that the two of them have done to help us all explore our own family histories and how that has been impacted by our relationship with Indigenous people, or lack of relationship.
Justin, can we say goodbye to Susan Point and then make it the Brady Bunch gathering so we can. There we go. That's good. So unmute yourselves now. Jill Harrison has a question. And Janice, Jill Harrison is the chair of our board, the current chair of our board.
Hi, Jill.
Hi, Janice. Thank you very much. That was fascinating family history, and very admirable your undertaking to bring those artifacts back. My question is about, you talked about how to get those 3D prints, you're concerned about how long it's going to take, and you alluded a little bit at the end, and I think I may have missed something. What's the process that's taking so long, or what are you having to go through with your cousin to get this all done?
The first thing, thanks for that, because it's multifaceted. The first thing we need to get is, feels to me like a vestige of colonialism. The museum, the Humboldt Forum, would like a letter from the Nuhawk Nation saying that they're interested in receiving these 3D scans. That's it. They don't want to make them available, I gather, unless they know that there's some interest, that it's not just Sigbjorn and myself saying, let's do this. So as I've been talking to the indigenous, the elected chief and council, that group, and the hereditary chiefs, I realize that they're not all on the same page, and there's some significant questions around who would own the scans and who would have access to the scans, how will they use them. So those are some of the important questions that we need to talk about together, so that we don't they don't end up having conflict about it afterwards. And some of that is happening in the has the potential to happen if they don't get that cleared up. So first off, we need a letter from the Nuhawk to the Humboldt Forum, which frankly I feel a little I feel like the colonial person saying, we need this letter from you. So what I've been saying to Sigbjorn is that I need the Humboldt Forum to write a letter to the Nuhawk Nation saying, we want to be in relationship with you. Can we collaborate with you, rather than, so not being top down, but let's do this together, so that we want to create this new relationship between the museum and the Nuhawk Nation. Once we get that letter, which I hope will come out of the consultation, then we can start doing some major fundraising to pay for these 3D scans. And at this point, I actually don't even know what the cost is, but it will not be, as Doug says, insignificant. So does that answer your question, Jill?
Yeah, I knew you had also said that the Nuhawk people themselves were at odds with this, and I kind of wondered, well, why wouldn't you want this back, or what were they concerned about? So your explanation there was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments, and I know like Maureen has a connection to Haida Gwaii. I mean, a lot of us here have connections with First Nations, which is wonderful to see. But any other comments for Janice?
Well, I'd just like to segue from your comment, Doug, and say that I was actually born in Dudgeon-Geeds, which was formerly known as Queen Charlotte City. I was born in the Skidegate Mission Hospital, which was Bill Reed's a famous carver also, home community. And I just feel really connected with the cedars and the ocean of that landscape. And I really loved hearing about your family story and your project, Janice. It's really encouraging. And just to add a recommendation, that I also sat in on that webinar course on healing haunted histories. And I think what we learned, those of us who participated, was how powerful it is to use personal family history and exploration of who and on what lands are we connected through our ancestors, or even if we first generation that have settled somewhere on somebody's territory, and to use that personal voyage of discovery. I'm just wondering if I redo mine, what projects of reconciliation might turn themselves up in conversations with the peoples that my family settled up on, their territories. So highly recommend that. And it's just been wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Doug.
I'd love to know what projects might come up for you too if you do that further exploration.
Well, and we can all do it. I think there'd just be a myriad of projects that could develop from that exploration.
So one of the things I forgot to say was that as I've been working on this project, and as I said, I really want it to happen, but what occurred to me with the help of the hereditary chiefs, when I was speaking with them last winter, I was expressing some frustration where I really want this to happen. This is such an important thing, this reconciliation work. And one of them looked at me and said, "Well, you're doing it right now just by being here." And I went, "Oh, right. Yeah." And just building the relationships, being together is really the work. If we get the 3D scans made, that's a bonus. But the work that we're doing now, just being together and being able to know one another and to call each other friend, whew, it just feels so amazing.
I thank you for that too, Janice. It just made me feel like I was there, so thank you. I really appreciate the presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. If you ever have a chance to go to Bella Coola, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful, beautiful place.
Looks great.
Now, what's behind Janice right now is where she went for a walk earlier today. Crescent Beach. Yeah. There's something about the color of the skies over the ocean over the Georgia Strait. And many here, Rich and others have spent time in Vancouver or lived in Vancouver or from Vancouver. So there's lots of connections. There's lots of connections here.
Maureen, when you mentioned about the feeling the closeness to the ocean and the cedar and the places where we're born, I think how that geography becomes so much a part of who we are and our own spirituality as well. Yeah. My husband and I went to Norway to visit Sigbjorn and his wife in 2019, and we were 4 days on a cruise ship going up over past the Arctic Circle and up to Tromsø. And I was amazed at how much it looked like British Columbia. I kept thinking I was on a BC ferries.
Other comments or questions? We have some other folks here. John, Matheson, you have got connections to Penetanguishene and the Wendat. And
actually, my childhood house where I went to grade 1 is right next door to the Martyr Shrine at Midland. And when you know the history of the area, you realize that in the 15th and 16th century, Europe showed up in my hometown and got martyred. That's where Brebeuf and Lallemand were martyred, right in my back garden, where I used to walk through their village to go fishing as a 6-year-old child. And we always knew there were people there before us, but we knew absolutely nothing about them.
Yeah.
Like nobody knew anything about the people who were there before. Interesting enough, there's a Subway restaurant in my hometown now that's staffed by people from India. And I said to them, when my family got here, we were looking for a shortcut to you. And now there's very little diversity in that area. But here's a whole family of people from India running a restaurant where we fished. And before us were indigenous people who were the main highway between Eastern Canada and Western Canada. Twice in the last 50 years, people have put canoes in my back garden and paddled past my house now in Montreal. Just I feel so connected. I look out my window, watch the St. Lawrence going by, and I think the water started there.
That is really cool.
Other comments? We've got some other people, Evan.
Thank you, Janice. It was really, really, really interesting, and I did appreciate everything you said. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I really appreciate you listening to my story.
No, it was easy to listen to.
Raymond is our past chair and current treasurer and a very important leader, an elder in the Filipino community here in Montreal. And Raymond, do you have any comments or any reflections from your experience from Philippines and here about what Janice said, if you would?
Well, it's very, very interesting to, when you trace your roots, and there's a lot of history there. It's just like back home. When we go home, I look for my my family tree, and there's a lot of history. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for sharing this. It will help us to reconcile our differences, and it will be a very positive approach to each and everyone. Thank you for your story.
Thank you. Others who have any comments or questions? I think maybe towards ending, because Janice hasn't had her supper, neither have I, but I'm okay. We're getting late. We're getting fashionable for Montreal. The whole aspect of feasting. And when I was at the consultation in Alberta, the first national conversation amongst Indigenous people, and met Dolly Lansdowne, Carmen's mother, and was subsequently invited to visit and to go up to her other home in Alert Bay, and to sit in this room with the masks and to look out from a cliff over to the ocean and watch a pod of orcas go up the sound. But I was also at her home in Oak Bay in Victoria. She had a potlatch for me and my partner at the time, and others. And there was Wilson, a Haida artist, and I had the Ulican grease and the elderwood smoked salmon and the herring roe and the kelp and the whole traditional aspects. They were surprised I liked the Ulican grease because it tasted like cod liver oil, and I was a weird kid and actually liked the taste of cod liver oil. So I was quite fine, and they were, because you dip things in it. And so that was my experience. So I said to Janice when she shared about being at the potlatch, well, how did you find the grease and the herring roe? And Janice shared that she didn't, because they can't now, because the Ulican is endangered. And that's something of my time that I experienced as very precious. And I'm not of that people. And for them not to be able to do that now, I find very painful, very painful. So I hope when we talk about governance, and especially, I guess I get quite worried now with 25% tariffs, and that money is the only thing that we talk about. What will happen to the environment, and that very fragile. You saw the lushness of it, but it's fragile. It's very fragile. So.
The Ulican stocks were decimated. They're not sure why, and they spawn annually up in the Bella Coola River in the early spring. In this past spring, for the first time, they had a significant number return. They didn't harvest any of them. They were leaving them to hopefully build the stock up, but the people were ecstatic that they had come back. So they're really, really working hard to try and make that happen, to grow the stocks.
Wow.
So we pray, but we not only pray, we put our feet to our prayers, and our voice and our vote and other aspects of this journey. So thank you, Janice. Merci beaucoup. Un grand plaisir.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and Doug, thank you for arranging that, and for the generous honorarium for this evening. And I want you to know that I'll be putting that towards the costs of our consultation, in the spring when Sigbjørn and I go back up to Bella Coola. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone. I hope we meet again sometime in Zoom land.
Yes. Interim, Janice, bon appetit.
Thank you. All right. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody. Good night. God
Bye-bye.
bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye.